Hello, dear traveller. Welcome to this quiet corner where stories unfold softly beneath the gentle veil of night. I'm so glad you found your way here this evening to this place of whispered tales and mysteries wrapped in moonlight. Tonight, we journey together to Victorian London, to a night when shadows grew long and a peculiar case found its way to the doorstep of England's most remarkable consulting detective. This story is designed to carry you gently towards sleep, to slow the racing thoughts that keep you from rest, to wrap you in atmosphere and wonder until your eyes grow heavy and dreams begin to weave themselves through consciousness. Before we begin, I'm curious. Where in this wide world are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're tucked beneath blankets in a room far across the ocean, or maybe you're close to where this story takes place, in lands where fog still rolls through cobblestone streets. Wherever you are, you're welcome here. In this space, we create together with words and imagination. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain had been falling steadily over London since the early hours of that October evening in 1894, each droplet whispering against the window panes of 221 B. Baker Street, with the persistence of a secret trying to be told. Inside those familiar rooms, the fireplace crackled with a warmth that pushed back against the autumn chill, flames dancing in patterns that seemed almost to speak their own language of comfort and protection. The gaslight burned low and golden, casting everything in that particular amber glow that makes even the most ordinary objects appear somehow touched by mystery and meaning. Dr. John Watson sat in his customary chair, the leather worn smooth by years of companionship and contemplation, a medical journal open across his lap, though his attention had long since drifted toward the rhythmic percussion of rain against glass. The scent of his pipe tobacco curled through the air, mixing with the older smells of the rooms, book leather and wood polish, the faint chemical tang from Sherlock Holmes's laboratory corner, the reassuring mustiness of papers and files that documented years of investigations, both extraordinary and mundane. Holmes himself occupied the space near the window, his tall, spare frame silhouetted against the rain-streaked glass as he gazed down into Baker Street below. He had been standing thus for nearly 20 minutes, so motionless that Watson had twice glanced up to ensure his friend hadn't somehow transformed into one of the shadow puppets the firelight cast upon the walls. The detective's fingers were steepled beneath his sharp chin, his grey eyes reflecting the street lamp's glow, his entire being radiating that peculiar quality of focused stillness that Watson had come to recognize as the prelude to either profound boredom or intense intellectual engagement. "The rain will continue through tomorrow morning," Holmes murmured without turning from the window, his voice quiet enough that Watson almost missed the words beneath the fire's gentle crackling. "Note how it falls, not the heavy drops of a summer storm passing through, but this fine, persistent precipitation that speaks of atmospheric conditions settling in for duration rather than drama. The clouds visible earlier suggested as much. That particular formation of stratocumulus one learns to recognize after sufficient observation." Watson smiled slightly, setting aside his journal with barely a whisper of paper against leather. "I had rather hoped for clear weather tomorrow," he replied, his voice equally soft, matching the contemplative atmosphere that the evening had woven around them. Mrs. Hudson mentioned something about the markets, though I confess I wasn't paying full attention. The rain has a soporific quality tonight, doesn't it? I find my thoughts wandering down pathways that lead nowhere in particular. Wandering thoughts are not always unproductive, Holmes said, finally turning from the window, his face emerging from shadow into the fire's warm light. The mind processes information in non-linear fashion when allowed to drift, making connections that rigid focus might overlook. I have solved more than one case while in that state, between waking thought and the threshold of sleep, when the conscious mind releases its tight grip and allows pattern recognition to proceed unimpeded by preconception. He moved from the window with that peculiar grace he possessed, crossing to his own chair and folding himself into it with the economical precision he brought to all physical movement. His long fingers drummed once against the chair's arm, then stilled. The fire reflected in his eyes, turning them momentarily amber before the angle shifted and they returned to their usual pale grey. "We have had no interesting cases in nearly a fortnight," Holmes observed, reaching for the pipe Watson had prepared earlier, the tobacco already packed precisely as he preferred it. The criminal classes appear to be observing some form of unexpected sabbatical, and while I appreciate the opportunities for rest that our shared practice affords, I confess the inactivity begins to wear upon the nerves. The mind requires stimulation as the body requires exercise, Watson. Deprive either of appropriate challenge and deterioration inevitably follows. Watson knew this mood, recognized the restless quality beginning to emerge beneath his friend's calm exterior. He reached for the small bell on the side table, its gentle chime summoning Mrs. Hudson before the sound had fully faded. Their landlady appeared moments later, bearing a tea tray with the quiet efficiency of someone who had anticipated the request before it was made. The cups she set before them steamed gently, releasing the comforting aroma of Earl Grey, the particular blend she kept specifically for evenings like this, when the weather turned contemplative, and her lodgers settled in for quiet conversation. "Will you be requiring anything else, gentlemen?" Mrs. Hudson asked, her voice carrying that maternal warmth she reserved for moments when she saw them, not as the famous detective and his companion, but simply as the two men who had occupied her best rooms for years, who needed looking after whether they acknowledged it or not. "This is perfect, Mrs. Hudson," Watson assured her with genuine warmth. "Thank you." She nodded, but before she could turn to leave, a sound emerged from the stairwell behind her. Footsteps, but hesitant ones, climbing with the uncertain rhythm of someone not entirely confident of their destination. All three of them turned toward the doorway as the steps approached, and then a figure appeared in the threshold, rain-soaked and breathless, a young messenger boy who couldn't have been more than 14 years old. "Begging your pardon," the boy gasped, water dripping from his cap onto Mrs. Hudson's polished floor. "Got a letter here for Mr. Sherlock Holmes, marked urgent-like. Man, what gave it me, said to deliver it tonight, no matter the hour or the weather. Paid extra for the promise." Holmes was on his feet instantly, the restless energy finding sudden focus. He crossed to the boy with quick strides, producing a coin from his pocket, even as he accepted the envelope. "You've done well to come out in such weather," he said, pressing the coin into the boy's damp palm. "Mrs. Hudson, perhaps something warm from the kitchen for our courier before he ventures back into the rain." The landlady nodded approvingly, ushering the grateful boy away with promises of hot tea and biscuits. Holmes returned to the firelight, turning the envelope over in his hands with the careful attention he brought to all potential evidence. Watson found himself leaning forward slightly, the medical journal forgotten entirely now, his own curiosity awakening. The envelope was of good quality paper, Watson noted, though the elements had taken their toll during the journey to Baker Street. The wax seal, dark red and still partially intact despite the rain's assault, bore an impression that Holmes examined closely through his pocket lens before breaking it. The detective's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign of surprise he typically permitted himself, and he withdrew several sheets of closely written paper, unfolding them with careful fingers. For several minutes, Holmes read in absolute silence, his eyes moving across the lines with that rapid, absorbing quality Watson had observed countless times before. The fire crackled softly. Rain continued its whispered conversation with the windows. A coal shifted in the grate, with a sound like a gentle exhalation. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Finally, Holmes looked up, and Watson saw something kindling behind his friend's eyes. That particular spark that indicated a puzzle worthy of attention, a mystery that would occupy that formidable intellect and save them both from the stagnation of inactivity. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of suppressed excitement, "how would you feel about a journey to the Cornish coast? I believe we have just received an invitation to investigate what may prove to be one of the most peculiar cases to cross our threshold." Watson felt his own interest stirring, that familiar anticipation that preceded their adventures together. Cornwall in October, I can think of worse destinations, particularly if a mystery awaits. What does the letter say? Holmes settled back into his chair, the pages balanced carefully across his knee, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the paper as he organized his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice took on that storytelling quality he sometimes employed, transforming the mere recitation of facts into something more atmospheric, more engaging. The letter is from a solicitor named Edmund Blackwood, writing from the village of Pendennis Point on the northern Cornish coast. He explains that he is contacting me on behalf of the Pendennis Parish Council regarding a situation they believe requires outside investigation. It seems that the lighthouse keeper of Pendennis Point, a man named Josiah Tremaine, disappeared 3 weeks ago under circumstances that the local authorities have been unable to explain satisfactorily. Watson reached for his teacup, the porcelain warm against his fingers, the Earl Grey's bergamot notes rising with the steam. A missing lighthouse keeper, he mused. That seems a matter for the local constabulary, surely. What makes this case require your particular expertise? Patience, Watson, Holmes replied with the ghost of a smile. The details are what elevate this from a simple missing person case to something altogether more intriguing. Josiah Tremaine had kept the lighthouse at Pendennis Point for 27 years. A man known for absolute reliability, devoted to his duty, regarded by all accounts as someone who would never abandon his post. The lighthouse sits on an isolated promontory, accessible only by a narrow causeway that becomes impassable at high tide, cutting the structure off from the mainland for hours at a time. He paused to draw on his pipe, the tobacco glowing briefly in the dimness. 3 weeks ago, on the night of September 20th, the lighthouse lamp failed to ignite. This was noticed immediately by several fishing vessels returning to port, as well as by residents of the village whose homes face the sea. The Coast Guard was alerted, and when the tide permitted passage early the following morning, they crossed to investigate. Holmes's voice grew softer, more measured, as he continued. They found the lighthouse completely secure, doors locked from the inside, windows shuttered against the autumn storms. They broke in through the main entrance and discovered everything in perfect order. The oil reservoir was full, the lamp mechanism in working condition, the logbook meticulously maintained up until the very day of the disappearance. Personal effects remained in place. Clothing, toiletries, a half-eaten meal on the table. But of Josiah Tremaine himself, not a trace could be found. Watson set down his teacup with careful precision, his medical training immediately cataloguing possibilities. He could have fallen from the rocks, been swept away by the sea. The tides and currents along that coast are treacherous, I understand. Indeed they are, Holmes agreed, and that was the initial conclusion of the local constable. However, several factors complicate that straightforward explanation. First, a thorough search of the surrounding rocks and coastline revealed no body, no evidence of a fall or struggle. Second, the lighthouse was, as I mentioned, locked from the inside, all doors, all windows secured. How does a man lock himself inside a building and then vanish from it? He lifted another page, his eyes scanning the careful script. But here is where the matter becomes truly interesting, Watson. Tremaine kept a personal diary in addition to the official lighthouse log. This diary was found on his desk, open to the final entry dated September 20th. The solicitor has included a transcription of the last several entries, and I must say, they make for rather fascinating reading. Outside, a carriage passed through Baker Street, its wheels hissing through rain-soaked cobblestones, the sound fading gradually into the distance until only the rain's steady whisper remained. Holmes began to read aloud, his voice taking on a slightly different cadence, as if channeling the voice of the missing lighthouse keeper across the miles and weeks that separated them. September 15th. The dreams continue, growing more vivid with each passing night. I see the chamber clearly now. The stone walls carved with symbols I do not recognize. The arrangement of objects on the central altar, if altar it is. The robed figures stand in their circle, chanting in a language that sounds ancient beyond measure. And though I cannot understand the words, I feel their purpose in my bones. A summoning, a calling forth of something that waits in the spaces between earth and sea. When I wake, I find sand beneath my fingernails, salt caked in the creases of my hands, though I have not left the lighthouse. Watson felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Holmes continued reading, his voice steady and calm, transforming the unsettling words into something more contemplative than frightening. September 17th. I have searched my books for explanation, consulted what few volumes on local history the Lighthouse Library contains. There are references, obscure, fragmentary, to practices that existed here long before the lighthouse was built, before Christianity came to these shores. The promontory was known by another name once, Carreg Ir Alwad, the Rock of Calling in the old tongue. Ships would founder on these rocks with troubling regularity, not in storms, but on clear nights when the stars shone bright and the sea lay calm as glass. The locals built the lighthouse not merely to guide vessels safely, I begin to suspect, but to serve another purpose entirely, to stand watch over something that requires watching. Holmes paused, reaching for his own teacup, sipping thoughtfully before continuing. The fire had burned down slightly, and Watson rose to add another piece of coal, the brief flare of renewed flame casting dancing shadows across the walls before settling back into steady warmth. September 19th. Holmes resumed. I am being called. There is no other way to describe the sensation. In my waking hours, I feel a pulling, an insistent tug at something deep within my consciousness, urging me toward the rocks below, toward the narrow cleft in the cliff face that I have passed 1,000 times without truly seeing. But I see it now, and I know that beyond it lies the chamber from my dreams. Tomorrow is the autumn equinox. I feel this is significant, though I cannot say precisely why. The old books speak of times when the barriers grow thin, when what has been separated may draw close again. I must resist this calling. I must maintain my vigil. The lamp must burn. And yet, I find my thoughts returning constantly to that cleft in the rocks, to the darkness beyond, to the promise of answers to questions I did not know I was asking. The reading paused. Holmes set aside that page and lifted the final sheet, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, matching the intimate, confessional tone of the lighthouse keeper's last written words. September 20th. Dusk approaches. I have lit the lamp early, ensuring it has sufficient oil to burn through the night, regardless of what may occur. If anyone reads these words, know that I do not go willingly to whatever fate awaits, and yet I find I cannot resist the compulsion that grows stronger with each passing hour. The calling has become a roar in my mind, drowning out all other thoughts. I must know what lies in that chamber. I must see with waking eyes what my dreaming mind has shown me. I pray I am strong enough to return, to resume my duties when this night has passed. But if I do not, if these are my final recorded words, then let them serve as warning. There are older things than lighthouse lamps that burn in darkness. There are depths that must not be plumbed, spaces that should remain unseen. I have been a faithful keeper for 27 years, but tonight I fear I shall fail in my duty. The rock calls, the chamber waits, and I can no longer deny the summons. May God forgive me. May whoever finds this forgive me. The lamp is lit. I descend now to discover what awaits. Silence filled the room when Holmes finished reading, broken only by the fire's gentle conversation with itself, and the rain's endless patience against the windows. Watson found himself gripping the arms of his chair more tightly than he'd realized, his imagination conjuring images of that lonely lighthouse, the isolated keeper driven by dreams toward some mysterious fate. Good Lord, Watson breathed finally. The man sounds as though he were under some form of psychological compulsion, a fixed delusion, perhaps, brought on by isolation and the monotony of his duties. Holmes made a non-committal sound, folding the papers with precise movements. That would certainly be the rational explanation, and yet Mr. Blackwood's letter includes additional details that complicate such a straightforward diagnosis. The locals have reported strange occurrences around the lighthouse promontory since Tremaine's disappearance. Unusual lights seen moving among the rocks at night. Sounds carrying across the water that one witness described as chanting in no earthly language. And most intriguingly, the discovery of what appears to be an entrance to a sea cave previously unknown, despite the area being thoroughly mapped for navigational purposes. He stood, moving to his desk, where he kept the railway timetables, flipping through pages with practiced efficiency. There is a train departing Paddington at 10 tomorrow morning that will connect us through Bristol to the Cornish branch line. We would arrive at Pendennis Point by early evening. Mr. Blackwood has arranged accommodation at the local inn and promises full cooperation from both the parish council and the Coast Guard. He emphasises that they desire discretion. The disappearance has already affected the local fishing fleet, with several crews refusing to sail until the matter is resolved. Superstition runs deep in such coastal communities, Watson, and unexplained events can paralyse an entire economy based on men's willingness to venture onto the sea. Watson nodded slowly, his practical nature reasserting itself, even as his imagination continued to populate the Cornish coast with shadows and mysteries. I should pack for variable weather, I assume. The coast at this time of year can be unpredictable. Indeed, warm layers, waterproof outerwear, and I would recommend sturdy footwear suitable for climbing over rocks. Bring your medical bag as well. One never knows what situations may arise, and I have found that isolated communities often lack immediate access to competent medical care. Holmes returned to his chair, his energy now purposeful rather than restless, the prospect of investigation transforming his entire demeanour. He drew on his pipe, regarding the glowing coals through half-closed eyes. I find this case intriguing on multiple levels, Watson. The psychological elements you mentioned, the dreams, the compulsion, suggest one avenue of investigation. Yet, the physical facts, the locked lighthouse, the sudden appearance of a previously unknown cave entrance, suggest another entirely. And then there are the historical elements Tremaine mentioned in his diary, the references to old practices and older purposes. A good mystery should have layers, like a palimpsest with multiple texts written atop one another, each revealing different truths depending on how one examines them. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the hour, 10 mellow notes that seemed to sink into the room's comfortable atmosphere like stones into still water. Mrs. Hudson appeared briefly to collect the tea things, her expression suggesting she had already intuited that her lodgers would soon be departing on another of their expeditions, and that she would once again be left to manage the steady stream of clients who appeared at 221B, regardless of whether its primary occupant was in residence. "Shall I prepare for your absence, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, confirming Watson's suspicion. "If you would be so kind, Mrs. Hudson. I anticipate we shall be away for perhaps 3 or 4 days, possibly longer, depending on what we discover. The usual arrangements, if you please. Correspondence forwarded if it appears urgent. Everything else held for our return." After she departed, Watson rose from his chair, stretching slightly, feeling the pleasant weariness that comes from an evening spent in comfortable company by a warm fire. "I should return to my own lodgings and organise my affairs," he said. "Shall I meet you at Paddington in the morning?" 9:30 should allow ample time, Holmes confirmed. "We can breakfast on the train. The Cornish line generally maintains a decent dining car." Watson collected his coat and hat from the stand near the door, but paused before departing, looking back at his friend, who had returned to his position by the window, once again gazing out into the rain-soaked London night. "Holmes," he ventured, "what do you truly believe happened to Josiah Tremaine? A man doesn't simply vanish from a locked building." The detective was silent for a long moment, his profile sharp against the window's dim glow. When he spoke, his voice carried a thoughtful quality that Watson had learned to recognize as Holmes operating at the edge of his knowledge, where deduction gave way to intuition, and the rational mind acknowledged the boundaries of the explicable. "I believe, Watson, that Tremaine discovered something, or something discovered him. Whether that something resides in the external world, or originated within his own troubled psyche, remains to be determined. But I suspect that when we reach Pendennis Point and examine that lighthouse and those rocks with clear eyes and methodical approach, we shall find that this mystery, however strange it appears, will ultimately yield to logic and careful observation. The universe operates according to natural laws, even when those laws produce outcomes that appear at first glance to violate possibility. Our task is to identify which laws were operating and how they combined to create the result we observe." He turned from the window, offering Watson a slight smile. "Sleep well, old friend. Tomorrow we venture into what I suspect will prove to be one of our more atmospheric cases. I find myself looking forward to it considerably." Watson returned the smile and descended the familiar stairs, emerging into Baker Street, where the rain continued its patient work of washing the city clean. A hansom cab appeared, as if summoned by his need, and as he climbed aboard and gave his address to the driver, he found his thoughts already travelling westward, toward Cornwall, and coasts where sea and stone kept secrets, toward a lighthouse standing sentinel over mysteries that called to sleeping minds with voices from older, stranger times. The cab rolled through wet streets, carrying him toward home and the preparation for journey, while behind him the windows of 221B glowed warmly in the darkness, and within those rooms Sherlock Holmes remained at his vigil by the window, his remarkable mind already assembling theories, discarding impossibilities, constructing the framework within which tomorrow's investigation would unfold. The rain whispered its endless secrets to the cobblestones, and London dreamed beneath its gentle persistence, unaware that in a quiet consulting room on Baker Street, a mystery had arrived that would lead its most famous resident into depths where reason and older forces would meet, where a lighthouse keeper's last words would echo across stone and water, where truths waited in darkness to be drawn into light. Morning arrived with the rain departed, replaced by low grey clouds that promised its eventual return. Watson stood on the platform at Paddington Station at precisely 9:30, his leather travel bag at his feet, his medical case in hand, watching the crowd of travellers moving with the purposeful chaos that characterised any major London terminus. The great iron framework overhead trapped steam and sound, creating an atmosphere that was somehow both industrial and oddly intimate. Hundreds of individual journeys beginning and ending in this vast cathedral, dedicated to the romance of travel. Holmes appeared from the crowd with his characteristic long-strided walk, dressed in his travelling clothes, a heavy wool coat against the October chill, his deerstalker cap already in place, a somewhat battered leather valise that Watson knew contained everything from reference books to specialized tools of observation and analysis. His grey eyes carried that bright, alert quality that indicated a mind fully engaged with interesting possibility. "Punctual as always, Watson." Holmes greeted him warmly. "Excellent. The train departs in 15 minutes, and I have secured a private compartment. Come." We have just time to settle ourselves before departure." They navigated through the crowd, past porters wheeling luggage, past emotional farewells and businesslike boardings, until they reached their assigned carriage and climbed aboard. The compartment was indeed private, the sort of accommodation that suggested Holmes had paid extra for the privilege of conversation, uninterrupted by fellow travellers. 2 facing bench seats, upholstered in worn but clean velvet, a small table between them, a window that currently framed the platform's controlled chaos. They arranged their luggage in the overhead rack and settled into their seats just as the whistle blew its warning note. Moments later, the train shuddered into motion, beginning that slow gathering of momentum that would transform into the steady rhythm of rail travel. The platform slid past, then the station's edge, then London itself began to unspool outside their window. First, the tight-packed buildings of the city proper, gradually giving way to less dense suburbs, and finally to the countryside beyond. Holmes had brought the morning papers, and for the first hour of the journey, both men occupied themselves with reading, comfortable in the silence that friendship allows. Watson found himself skimming articles without fully absorbing them, his attention repeatedly drawn to the passing landscape, watching as autumn-touched fields rolled by, as small villages appeared and vanished, as the world transformed from the familiar to the gradually more distant and different. When the dining car steward appeared to announce breakfast service, they made their way through the swaying corridor to the dining carriage, where white-clothed tables set with silver and china created an incongruous elegance within the rattling, travelling context. They ordered eggs and toast, coffee and marmalade, and ate while watching the countryside continue its steady parade beyond the windows. "I telegraphed ahead to Mr. Blackwood last night," Holmes mentioned, cutting his toast into precise squares. "Informed him of our arrival time. He will meet us at Pendennis Point Station with a trap to convey us to the village and the inn where he's arranged our accommodation. I requested that he also arrange access to the Lighthouse tomorrow morning at low tide, and that he gather any individuals who might have relevant information regarding Tremaine's habits and state of mind in the days before his disappearance." Watson nodded, stirring milk into his coffee, watching the liquid swirl into gradual uniformity. "Did you have opportunity to research the area? I confess I know very little about that particular stretch of the Cornish coast." "I spent several hours with my references after you departed last night," Holmes replied. "Pendennis Point is a small fishing village, population approximately 300 souls, dependent primarily on pilchard fishing and some small-scale farming of the inland areas. The lighthouse was constructed in 1851, following a series of particularly disastrous wrecks. 7 vessels lost in a single winter, with significant loss of life. The promontory itself is granite, part of the same geological formation that characterizes much of Cornwall's northern coast. The village has the usual amenities: a church, an inn, a handful of shops, the solicitor's office, a coastguard station. He paused to sip his coffee, his eyes distant with recollection. There are, however, some interesting historical notes. The area has a long association with what we might call folk traditions. Stories of smuggling, certainly, but also darker tales involving shipwrecking as a profession, and references in older documents to practices the early Christian missionaries found troubling enough to warrant specific condemnation. The name Tremaine mentioned in his diary Carragher Alward appears in several sources, always with a certain circumspection, as if the chroniclers were uncomfortable discussing it directly. Watson felt that slight thrill of anticipation, the sense of approaching a story still unfolding, a mystery not yet understood. What sort of practices? The details are frustratingly vague, Holmes admitted. References to ceremonies performed at certain tides, to calling rites that brought ships to the rocks, to a tradition of what one 18th century parson described as communion with entities best left unacknowledged by Christian souls. Much of it could be dismissed as exaggeration, the coastal equivalent of Gothic fancy applied to ordinary, if unpleasant, historical facts about smuggling and wrecking. And yet, the consistency of the themes across multiple centuries suggests some underlying truth, however distorted by superstition and time. The train clattered over a junction, the rhythm briefly syncopated before settling back into its steady pattern. Outside, a farmer guided a horse-drawn plough through a half-turned field, the scene archetypal and timeless. Humanity working in partnership with earth and animal as it had for millennia. They finished their breakfast and returned to their compartment, where Holmes withdrew a small leather-bound notebook and began writing in his tight, precise hand, organizing his thoughts, constructing the initial framework of investigation. Watson watched the landscape for a while longer, then found his own eyes growing heavy with the train's rocking motion and the early morning's exertions. He allowed them to close, not quite sleeping, but entering that pleasant state between wakefulness and dreams where consciousness floats free of immediate demands. The train's rhythm became a lullaby, the occasional whistle a counterpoint, and time dissolved into a continuous present, unmarked by specific moments, only the sense of moving forward through space while remaining still within the small contained world of their compartment. He woke when the train's rhythm changed, the steady clatter slowing as they approached Bristol for the connection. Holmes was still absorbed in his notebook, but looked up as Watson stirred, offering a slight smile. "We've made good time. The connection should be straightforward. Platform 6 to Platform 12, 20 minutes interval. The final leg to Cornwall takes approximately 3 hours, though the scenery improves considerably once we're past Exeter." The change at Bristol was indeed straightforward, and soon they were aboard the westbound train, now travelling through Devon toward Cornwall. The landscape grew more dramatic, the fields giving way to moorland, the villages becoming smaller and more isolated, the stone of the buildings changing in character as local geology asserted itself. They passed through Exeter, then beyond into increasingly wild country, where ancient granite pushed through green earth like bones through flesh, where the sky seemed larger somehow, the light different from London's filtered glow. Holmes abandoned his notebook and joined Watson in simply watching the landscape unspool. Neither felt the need to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. The journey itself became a meditation, a gradual shedding of city concerns, a preparation for whatever awaited in that small coastal village where a lighthouse keeper had vanished, leaving only his diary's cryptic warnings. The train followed the coast now, and through gaps in the hills, Watson caught glimpses of the sea, grey and vast under the overcast sky, whitecaps visible where wind troubled the surface. The Atlantic stretched away to the horizon, and somewhere beyond that horizon lay Ireland, and then America, and beyond that, the edge of maps where imagination populated emptiness with possibility. It was easy in such moments to understand why this coastline had generated so many stories, why the meeting place of land and sea inspired both poetry and unease. Small stations came and went, each announced by a signboard bearing names that sounded like half-remembered songs in an ancient tongue. Bodmin Road, Parr, St. Austell, each marking their progress deeper into Cornwall, closer to their destination. The light was beginning to shift toward late afternoon gold by the time the conductor passed through calling, "Pendennis Point, next stop, Pendennis Point," and they gathered their belongings, preparing for arrival. The station was modest, a single platform with a small stone shelter, a wooden signboard confirming the name, and beyond it, a view of hills rolling down toward the sea. Only a handful of passengers descended with them, locals by their dress and manner, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of small community life. As Holmes and Watson's feet touched the platform, a figure approached from the shelter, a man in his middle years, respectably dressed in a dark suit with a somewhat threadbare quality that suggested modest professional circumstances, his face weathered by coastal wind, but intelligent and kind in expression. "Mr. Holmes, Doctor." "Watson," he inquired, his voice carrying the melodic lilt of Cornish speech, each syllable shaped slightly differently from London English. "I am Edmund Blackwood. Thank you for coming. I trust the journey was not too tiresome?" Holmes shook his hand with genuine warmth. "Not at all, Mr. Blackwood. The journey allowed time for contemplation, which is always valuable. This is indeed Dr. Watson, my colleague and friend, upon whose judgment and assistance I rely completely." Watson shook hands as well, noting Blackwood's firm grip and the direct honesty of his gaze. This was a man who could be trusted, Watson's instincts told him, someone earnest in his desire to resolve the mystery that had brought them west. "I have a trap waiting just beyond the station," Blackwood explained, gesturing toward the small yard where a horse and two-wheeled conveyance stood patiently. "The village is perhaps 2 miles distant. We can reach the inn before full dark if we proceed directly, and I have arranged dinner there for 7 o'clock, at which time I can provide more detailed information regarding poor Tremaine's disappearance and the subsequent discoveries." They loaded their bags into the trap and climbed aboard, the horse setting off at a comfortable pace down a lane that wound between hedgerows tall enough to create a living tunnel. Blackwood handled the reins competently, guiding them with the unconscious skill of someone who had travelled this route countless times. "You've lived here long, Mr. Blackwood?" Watson inquired, curious about this place that would be their temporary home. "All my life, Dr. Watson," Blackwood replied. "My father was solicitor here before me, and his father before him. The Blackwoods have served Pendennis Point for 4 generations, managing wills and contracts, property transfers, and the occasional dispute. It is a quiet life by London standards, I'm certain, but not without its own richness. We know everyone here, and everyone knows us. When something troubles the community, we feel it personally, you understand. Josiah Tremaine's disappearance, it has cast a shadow over everyone. He was a good man, a respected man, and the manner of his vanishing troubles the soul as much as the mind." The lane emerged from between the hedgerows, and suddenly the vista opened before them, rolling hills descending to a bay where grey sea met grey sky in a line barely distinguishable, and nestled along the curve of that bay, the village of Pendennis Point. Stone cottages with slate roofs clustered together, as if for protection against the wind, that Watson could now hear whistling across the open landscape. A church tower rose above the other buildings, grey stone against grey sky, its bell silent at this hour, but eloquent nonetheless in its patient watching over the community it served. And beyond the village, on a narrow promontory of dark rock extending into the sea, like an accusing finger, stood the lighthouse. Even from this distance, Watson could see its distinctive profile, the cylindrical tower painted white with a red band, the gallery and lantern room at its top, the small keeper's cottage attached to its base. The promontory itself was perhaps 100 yards long, narrow enough that the sea wrapped around it on 3 sides, connected to the mainland by what appeared to be a natural causeway of rock and accumulated sand that was even now being troubled by waves as the tide began its advance. "There it stands," Blackwood said quietly, following their gaze. 36 meters tall, visible for 16 nautical miles in clear weather. For 27 years, Josiah Tremaine tended its light without fail. And now it stands dark, because none will volunteer to take his place, and I cannot in conscience assign anyone to a duty that seems to have cost the previous keeper his soul, if not his life. Holmes studied the lighthouse with that intense focus he brought to observation, his eyes moving systematically across the structure, the promontory, the surrounding coastline, filing away details for later analysis. We shall visit it tomorrow at first light, during low tide when the causeway is passable. Tonight, we gather information, speak with those who knew Tremaine, begin to construct a picture of his state of mind and his circumstances. But yes, tomorrow the lighthouse itself must tell us what it knows. The trap descended toward the village, passing fields where sheep grazed, where a farmer repaired a stone wall with patient skill, where smoke rose from cottage chimneys to be immediately torn and scattered by the wind. They entered the village proper, passing along a street of well-maintained stone buildings. A baker's shop, a chandlery, a small general store displaying its goods in a window crowded with practical necessities. A few villagers stopped to watch their passage, their expressions curious but reserved, the natural caution of insular communities toward outsiders. The inn revealed itself at the village centre, a substantial building of grey stone with a wooden sign depicting a sailing ship and bearing the name The Mariner's Rest in faded but still legible paint. Blackwood drew the trap to a halt before its entrance, and a young man emerged to help with their bags. The solicitor jumped down and gestured toward the doorway. "The proprietor, Mrs. Pascoe, has prepared her best rooms for you. I have taken the liberty of arranging to dine with you this evening. I hope that is not presumptuous. There are several others who I believe should speak with you regarding Tremaine, and I have invited them to join us after dinner, if you are not too fatigued from your journey." "Not at all," Holmes assured him. "The sooner we can begin gathering information, the better. You have been most thoughtful in your arrangements, Mr. Blackwood." They entered the inn, ducking slightly beneath the low doorframe, and found themselves in a lobby that managed to be both modest and welcoming. The ceiling was low-beamed, the walls whitewashed, the floor laid with flagstones worn smooth by generations of footsteps. A fire burned in a large hearth, and the air carried the scent of wood smoke and cooking, the pleasant domestic aromas that promised comfort against the evening's advancing chill. Mrs. Pascoe materialized from a side door, a woman of middle years with the capable appearance of someone accustomed to managing both property and people. She greeted them warmly, showed them to their respective rooms on the first floor. Simple but clean, each with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small window overlooking either the street or the sea beyond. Watson's room faced seaward, and when he opened his window slightly to admit fresh air, the sound of waves reached him across the intervening buildings, a constant rhythmic presence that he suspected would become the soundtrack to their stay. He unpacked his modest belongings, washed the travel dust from his face and hands in the basin, changed his collar, and descended to find Holmes already in the dining room, seated at a table near the hearth, where Edmund Blackwood waited with a carafe of wine and 3 glasses. Watson joined them, accepting a glass gratefully, feeling the wine's warmth spread through him like liquid restoration. "I have taken the liberty of ordering for us," Blackwood explained. "Mrs. Pascoe serves an excellent fish pie using the local catch, and her vegetables come from her own garden. Simple fare, gentlemen, but honest and well prepared." "That sounds perfect," Watson assured him, and indeed, when the food arrived shortly thereafter, carried by a young serving girl who couldn't have been more than 16, it proved to be exactly as Blackwood had described: substantial, flavourful, warming after the day's travels. They ate with appetite, making small conversation about the journey, about Cornwall's beauty, about the peculiarities of small-town life compared to the metropolis. Only when the dishes had been cleared and they sat with fresh wine did Holmes steer the conversation toward their purpose. "Mr. Blackwood, you mentioned in your letter that several unusual occurrences have been reported since Tremaine's disappearance. Could you elaborate on those? It would be helpful to separate verified facts from rumour and speculation." The solicitor nodded, his expression growing more serious. He withdrew a small notebook from his coat pocket, a gesture that reminded Watson of Holmes's own habits, and consulted it as he spoke. "I have attempted to document credible reports while filtering out the more fanciful claims that inevitably arise in such situations. Beginning with the night of September 20th, when the lamp failed to light, we have the following incidents supported by multiple witnesses. Strange lights, not lighthouse illumination, but smaller, moving lights, observed on the promontory and among the rocks below the lighthouse. These have been seen on at least 7 separate nights, always after midnight, always moving in what witnesses describe as purposeful patterns rather than random motion." He paused, sipping his wine as if fortifying himself. "Second, sounds carrying across the water. 3 different fishing crews have reported hearing what they describe as chanting or singing in an unknown language, emanating from the direction of the promontory during the hours around midnight. The descriptions vary somewhat, but all agree it was multiple voices engaged in rhythmic vocalization. 2 of the crews were far enough out that they should not have been able to hear any sound from shore at all, given wind and wave noise, yet all insist they heard it clearly, as if it were somehow projected across the water." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And the cave entrance you mentioned in your letter, that was discovered when?" 4 days after Tremaine's disappearance. The Coast Guard conducted a thorough search of the promontory and the rocks around its base, looking for any sign of the missing keeper. During this search, they discovered what appears to be an entrance to a sea cave approximately 50 meters from the lighthouse, on the seaward side of the promontory. The entrance is concealed behind a fall of rocks and is only accessible at the lowest tides. According to the Coast Guard captain, who has patrolled this coast for 15 years, he had never noticed this entrance before, despite having examined those rocks countless times. Watson frowned thoughtfully. Could it have been revealed by recent storm damage? Rocks shifted to expose what had been previously hidden. That was my first thought as well, Dr. Watson, Blackwood replied. However, Captain Treelaw insists that the opening shows no evidence of recent alteration, no fresh rockfalls, no displacement of material. It appears to have always been there, simply unnoticed until now. He admits this makes little sense, but stands by his observation. Has anyone explored this cave? Holmes asked. Blackwood's expression became uncomfortable. Captain Treelaw entered approximately 10 meters with several of his men, intending to conduct a full survey. They found that the passage angles downward and appears to extend some distance into the rock. However, they also found, and I quote from his report, markings carved into the stone walls of an ancient and disturbing nature, and what appeared to be evidence of recent human presence. Footprints in the sand at the cave entrance, leading inward but not outward, and... He paused, clearly troubled by what he was about to relate, and marks in the sand further in that he described as suggesting something had been dragged deeper into the cave. The fire crackled softly, and a log settled with a sound like a sigh. Watson found himself gripping his wineglass more tightly, his imagination conjuring images he had to consciously dismiss. This was investigation, not Gothic fancy, though the details certainly possessed an unsettling quality. Captain Treelaw discontinued the exploration at that point. Blackwood continued. He intended to organize a more thorough expedition with additional men and equipment, but before he could do so, one of the men who had accompanied him into the cave took ill with severe nightmares and refused to return. Another reported similar symptoms. Treelaw himself admitted to experiencing what he termed a profound sense of wrongness the deeper they proceeded. The exploration has not been resumed. Holmes absorbed this information with that absolute focus that transformed him from merely attentive to utterly present. Has anyone attempted to trace the footprints you mentioned? Could they be definitely identified as Tremane's? The size and pattern are consistent with the boots found in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, Blackwood confirmed, though I am aware that is not conclusive identification. As for tracing them, they were partially obscured by the tide's action even at the time of discovery, and have since been entirely erased by subsequent tides. If we wish to examine the cave entrance, it will need to be tomorrow at low tide, which occurs at approximately 6:30 in the morning. Then we shall be there at 6:30, Holmes stated simply. I would like to speak with Captain Treelaw this evening if possible, and with anyone else who had regular contact with Tremaine in the weeks before his disappearance. Blackwood nodded. I have taken the liberty of asking several individuals to make themselves available here this evening if you feel sufficiently rested for such interviews. Captain Treelaw has agreed to come, as has Peter Kendrick, a fisherman who was among Tremaine's few close friends. Also Mary Trenoweth, who brought supplies to the Lighthouse weekly and perhaps knew Tremaine's domestic habits better than anyone. And Father Cadogan from the church. Tremaine attended services regularly and apparently sought the priest's counsel several times in the weeks before his disappearance. Excellent, Holmes approved. Shall we begin whenever they arrive? Watson, you might take notes during these conversations. Multiple perspectives on the same subject often reveal patterns that single accounts obscure. Watson nodded, withdrawing his own notebook and pencil from his coat. Mrs. Pascoe appeared to refresh their wine and inquire whether they needed anything further. The fire had been built up against the evening's increasing chill, and the dining room had taken on that cosy, enclosed feeling of a safe space carved from surrounding darkness. The first to arrive was Captain Treelaw, a weather-hardened man of perhaps 50 years, his face so deeply tanned and creased by sun and wind that it seemed carved from the same leather used for ship's rigging. His handshake was powerful, his gaze direct and assessing. He wore his Coast Guard uniform with the unconscious pride of someone for whom duty was identity. The brass buttons polished, the dark blue wool immaculate despite the evening's damp. Mr. Holmes, he said, his voice carrying the authority of command softened by natural courtesy. Dr. Watson, Edmund has explained your purpose here. I'm glad you've come. This business has troubled me considerably, in ways I'm not entirely comfortable admitting. Holmes gestured to a chair, and they arranged themselves around the hearth. Watson with his notebook ready, Blackwood providing context where necessary, the captain settling into his account with the organized precision of someone accustomed to making reports. I've known Josiah Tremaine for the entire time I've been stationed here, 15 years this November. He was already established as keeper when I arrived, with a reputation for absolute reliability. In all that time, I cannot recall the lamp ever failing to light. Through storms that would make you believe the world was ending, through fog so thick you could barely see your hand before your face. The man was devoted to his duty in a way that bordered on religious calling. He paused, accepting wine from Mrs. Pascoe, nodding his thanks. Approximately 6 weeks before his disappearance, I noticed a change in his demeanor. We would meet occasionally when I conducted my regular inspections of the lighthouse. Brief conversations, mainly about weather conditions and shipping traffic. But in those final weeks, he seemed distracted, troubled. When I inquired whether everything was satisfactory, he brushed off my concern, but I could see something was weighing on him. Did he give any indication what might be troubling him? Holmes asked. Nothing specific. However, I did observe that he had been consulting various books, old volumes about local history that he had apparently borrowed from the church library. They were spread across his desk when I visited 3 weeks before his disappearance. When I commented on them, he said something I found odd at the time, and have found more troubling in retrospect. He said, "This lighthouse wasn't the first thing built to keep watch here, Captain. Men have stood guard on this rock for reasons older than navigation." The captain frowned at the memory. I asked what he meant, but he wouldn't elaborate, just shook his head and returned the conversation to routine matters. I assumed he was simply delving into local history as a hobby, perhaps to pass the long hours of isolation. But now, considering what's happened, I wonder if he had discovered something specific, something that disturbed him. Holmes made a note in his own small book. "And the cave entrance you discovered, you're certain it had never been visible before?" "Mr. Holmes, I have walked those rocks in every weather and tide condition, at every hour of day and night. I have examined that coastline with attention to detail because lives depend on such knowledge. I would stake my reputation on the assertion that the entrance had never been visible before, not merely unnoticed, but literally not visible. Whether that means it was somehow concealed or blocked, or... He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction his thoughts were taking. Or whether it appeared through some other means, I cannot say. I know only that it was not there, and then it was. Watson looked up from his notes, unable to resist asking. But surely that's impossible. Rock doesn't simply appear or disappear. I am aware of the impossibility, Doctor, Treloar replied, meeting his gaze. And yet, I report what I observed, or rather, what I failed to observe previously, and then did observe. I'm a practical man, not given to fancy. If I tell you something about these waters and these rocks, you can rely upon it. Which is precisely why this entire matter disturbs me so deeply. It seems to violate everything I understand about the physical world I've spent my adult life mastering. The door opened again, admitting a man whose entire bearing spoke of the sea. Peter Kendrick, the fisherman Blackwood had mentioned. He was perhaps 40, his hands scarred and calloused from a lifetime of nets and lines, his clothes carrying the faint but unmistakable scent of salt and fish that no amount of washing could entirely remove. He greeted the captain with familiar ease, shook hands with Holmes and Watson, and accepted the chair Mrs. Pascoe brought for him. "You want to know about Josiah," he said, without preamble, his voice carrying the same musical lilt as Blackwood's, but roughened by weather and shouting over wind. He was my friend, as much as a man like him had friends, kept to himself mostly, but we'd share a drink when he came to village, maybe once a month, when relief keeper spelled him for a day. Good man, quiet, thoughtful, not the sort to lose his wits or abandon his duty. "When did you last see him?" Holmes inquired. 2 days before he vanished. I was out checking pots when I saw him on the rocks below the lighthouse, which was unusual. He rarely descended from the structure, except when absolutely necessary. He seemed to be examining the cliff face, running his hands over the stone like he was searching for something. I called out to him, but the wind took my voice. He didn't notice me, and I thought little of it at the time. Just Josiah being Josiah, thorough in everything he did. Kendrick accepted a pipe that Blackwood offered, tamping tobacco with practiced fingers. But there's something else, something I didn't mention before because it seemed mad. That same day, in the evening after I'd returned to port, I saw something from my cottage window. The lighthouse lamp was already burning. Josiah was always early to light it, never risked darkness. But below the lighthouse, on the rocks, I saw other lights, small ones, moving. At first, I thought it was reflection off the water, but these moved purposefully, in patterns, like people carrying lanterns, walking specific paths among the rocks. "Could you make out any figures?" Holmes asked, his attention completely focused. I fetched my glass, a decent telescope I keep for watching weather approach. Even with that, I couldn't see clearly. Just the lights moving, maybe 6 or 8 of them, weaving among the rocks in what looked almost like a dance, following the same paths over and over. This went on for perhaps half an hour, and then they simply vanished, all at once, like snuffing candles. The lighthouse lamp continued burning normally, but those other lights just ceased. Watson found himself writing rapidly, trying to capture both the words and the conviction in Kendrick's voice. This was not the account of someone seeking attention or embellishing for effect. This was a man reporting what he had seen as accurately as possible, regardless of how implausible it might sound. The fisherman continued, drawing on his pipe, the tobacco's sweet smoke curling upward. I wasn't the only one to see such things. Several others mentioned similar lights in the days before and after Josiah's disappearance. And the sounds, God above, the sounds, like nothing I've heard in 30 years working these waters. Chanting, singing, words that made no sense, carrying across the waves like the sea itself was speaking. I heard it twice, both times past midnight when I couldn't sleep. The second time was 3 nights after Josiah vanished, and I will confess to you, gentlemen, that I rose from my bed and made the sign of the cross, which I hadn't done since I was a boy. A silence settled over the group, broken only by the fire's conversation with itself, and the distant sound of waves against the harbour wall. Watson glanced at Holmes and saw his friend's expression, alert, engaged, filing away every detail, but showing no sign of skepticism or dismissal. Whatever was happening in Pendennis Point, it was affecting multiple witnesses in ways that demanded explanation, however strange that explanation might ultimately prove. The door opened once more, this time admitting 2 people together, a middle-aged woman in a practical wool dress and shawl, and an elderly man in clerical dress whose white collar gleamed in the firelight. These would be Mary Trenoweth and Father Cadogan. Blackwood performed introductions, additional chairs were arranged, and the circle around the hearth expanded to accommodate the newcomers. Mary Trenoweth possessed the weathered competence of someone who had worked hard all her life without complaint. She carried a basket, which she set aside before seating herself, folding her work-roughened hands in her lap with an air of patient waiting. When Holmes invited her to share what she knew of Josiah Tremaine, she spoke in a clear, steady voice that suggested intelligence and observation despite her lack of formal education. I brought supplies to the Lighthouse every week for 12 years, Mr. Holmes. Groceries, lamp oil, whatever Josiah needed. I knew his habits, his preferences, the rhythms of his life. In all that time, I never knew him to be anything but steady, reliable, kind in his quiet way. But in those last weeks, she paused, her expression troubled. He changed, not all at once, but gradually, like watching the tide turn. He became distracted, would start sentences and not finish them. His cottage, which had always been immaculately maintained, grew cluttered with books and papers. I asked if he was well, and he assured me he was, but I could see otherwise. She withdrew a folded cloth from her pocket, worrying it between her fingers. The very last time I saw him, 3 days before he disappeared, he gave me something. Said he wanted me to keep it safe, just in case. I asked, in case of what? But he wouldn't say clearly, just muttered something about keeping watch and forgetting why we watch. I put it away when I got home, and honestly forgot about it, until after he vanished. Then I remembered and thought it might be important. From the basket at her feet, she withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth and handed it to Holmes. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a stone about the size of a man's palm, irregular in shape, dark grey in colour, but marked with carved symbols that even in the firelight appeared to possess a certain depth, as if the carving had been done with exceptional skill and patience. Holmes examined it closely, turning it over in his long fingers, holding it near the lamp to study the markings in better light. "Fascinating," he murmured. "These symbols are not any writing system I immediately recognize, yet they possess a definite structure, suggesting they are indeed meant to convey meaning rather than being merely decorative. Watson, what do you make of it?" Watson rose to examine the stone more closely. The symbols were indeed strange, angular but somehow flowing, combining straight lines and curves in patterns that seemed almost familiar, as if echoing some half-remembered alphabet from humanity's distant past. Running his finger lightly across them, he noted the carving was quite deep and showed signs of considerable age, the edges worn smooth by time or handling. "Where did Tremaine get this?" Holmes asked Mary. "He said he found it while examining the rocks below the lighthouse. He was quite excited about it, but also troubled. Said it confirmed something he had been researching, something about the site's history before the lighthouse was built. He wanted me to keep it safe, away from the promontory, as if he feared it might be taken or lost if it remained at the lighthouse." Holmes wrapped the stone carefully and placed it on the table before him. "Thank you, Mrs. Trenoweth. This may prove significant. Did Tremaine say anything else about the symbols or what they might mean?" She shook her head. "Only that they were old, very old, older than the church, older than the village, older than what he called the Christian memory of this place. He said such things so quietly, almost as if he feared being overheard, even though we were quite alone in the lighthouse cottage." Father Cadogan, who had been listening intently, now spoke for the first time. His voice was soft and cultured, carrying the slight lilt of Welsh origins overlaying the local accent. A man who had come to Cornwall from elsewhere and had stayed long enough to become part of its landscape. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am glad Mrs. Trenoweth mentioned the church, for it provides context for what I must tell you. Josiah Tremaine came to see me approximately 10 days before his disappearance. He was deeply troubled, seeking what I initially understood to be spiritual counsel, but which I came to realize was something rather different. The priest accepted tea that Mrs. Pascoe brought. He apparently abstained from wine, and cradled the cup in his hands, as if its warmth provided comfort against the recounting. Josiah asked me about the church's founding, about what had stood in Pendennis Point before Christianity arrived. I told him what I knew, that the village had likely been a Celtic settlement, that there had been various pagan practices the early missionaries had worked to supplant with the gospel. He asked specifically about the promontory, whether the church records contained any information about it. Father Cadogan sipped his tea, gathering his thoughts. I recalled seeing references in the very oldest documents in our archive, a collection of papers and books that go back, in some cases, to the 15th century, though most are later. I offered to let Josiah examine them, which he did over the course of several visits. He became quite absorbed in a particular volume, a sort of local chronicle maintained by various vicars over the centuries. When I asked what he was finding, he showed me a passage written in the margin of a page dated 1632. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Holmes leaned forward, his expression intent. Did Tremaine comment on this passage? He said it confirmed what he had been experiencing, Father Cadogan replied. I asked what he meant, and after some hesitation, he told me about the dreams. Vivid, recurring dreams of rituals performed on the promontory, of robed figures calling to something beyond the boundary of the visible world. He said the dreams had been growing stronger, more detailed, and that he had begun to fear they were not dreams at all, but memories, though he could not explain whose memories or how they had come to him. The priest's expression was deeply troubled. I counseled him to pray, to resist any compulsion he felt toward unhealthy thoughts or actions. I offered to come to the lighthouse and bless it, but he declined, saying he did not think it would help, that whatever was happening operated on a level beyond conventional religious practice. That was the last time I saw him. I have prayed for him daily since, but I confess I do not know whether prayers avail against whatever has occurred. The fire had burned lower, and Mrs. Pascoe came to add more wood, the flames leaping up again, casting renewed light and shadow across the faces gathered in the circle. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and the sound of the wind had increased, carrying with it the sea's rhythmic assertion of its presence, its power, its indifference to human concerns. Holmes sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed in the expression Watson knew meant intense mental activity. For several minutes, no one spoke, each lost in their own thoughts, processing the accumulation of strange details, the building sense of something larger and more complex than any of them could yet fully grasp. Finally, Holmes stirred, his eyes opening fully, focusing on each person in turn. You have all been most helpful, and I thank you for your candor in sharing accounts that I recognize must seem, even to yourselves, difficult to credit. Let me summarize what we have established. A reliable, experienced lighthouse keeper begins experiencing vivid dreams of ancient rituals. He researches the history of the promontory and discovers references to ceremonies performed there in pre-Christian times. He finds a carved stone bearing unknown symbols. His behavior becomes increasingly troubled and distracted. Finally, on the autumn equinox, he disappears from a locked lighthouse, leaving behind a diary entry suggesting he felt compelled to explore a cave whose entrance was subsequently discovered by the Coast Guard, though it had not previously been visible. He paused, letting the summary settle. Additionally, we have multiple reliable witnesses reporting unusual lights and sounds around the promontory, both before and after Tremaine's disappearance. These reports are consistent enough to discount mass delusion or coincidence. Something has been occurring at that location, whether it is something naturally explicable or something more unusual remains to be determined. Captain Treelaw shifted in his chair. Mr. Holmes, I am a rational man, as I believe I have established, but I must ask, is it your experience that all mysteries ultimately have rational explanations? Or are there cases in your career where you have encountered, I hesitate even to frame the question, where you have encountered phenomena that defy conventional understanding? It was a fair question, and Watson found himself curious about how Holmes would answer. His friend was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I have learned never to dismiss evidence simply because it challenges my preconceptions, Holmes said finally. The universe is vast, and humanity's understanding of natural law remains incomplete. That said, I have consistently found that what appears supernatural often proves to be natural, but unusual, misunderstood, or deliberately obscured. My approach will be to gather evidence methodically, examine the physical location thoroughly, and construct explanations based on observable facts. If those facts lead toward conclusions that challenge conventional understanding, then so be it. But I will not arrive at such conclusions prematurely. He stood, signaling the conclusion of the evening's discussions. I propose we meet at the Lighthouse at 6:30 tomorrow morning. Captain Treelaw, if you would be willing to guide us and provide access to the cave entrance, I would be grateful. Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you could accompany us as well. The rest of you have been invaluable, and I may need to call upon you again as the investigation proceeds. The group began to disperse, each offering farewells and wishes for success in the investigation. Mrs. Pascoe appeared to bank the fire and extinguish unnecessary lamps. Within minutes, Holmes and Watson found themselves alone in the dining room, the inn settling into nighttime quiet around them. "Well, Watson," Holmes said softly, "what do you make of it all?" Watson closed his notebook, tucking it into his pocket. "I confess I'm uncertain. The witnesses seem credible, their accounts consistent, and yet the implications are deeply unsettling. If we take them at face value, we must entertain possibilities that science would reject. Indeed, which is precisely why tomorrow's examination of the physical evidence becomes crucial. Whatever happened to Josiah Tremaine, there will be traces, clues, evidence that tells the story more reliably than even honest witnesses can. Dreams and compulsions, lights and sounds, these are suggestive, but ultimately subjective. The lighthouse itself, the cave, the rocks, these will speak to us if we ask the right questions. They climbed the stairs to their rooms, the old wood creaking softly under their footsteps. At his door, Holmes paused. "Get what rest you can, Watson. Tomorrow may prove taxing, and I suspect we will need clear heads for whatever we discover." Watson entered his room, which Mrs. Pascoe had prepared with a warming pan in the bed and fresh water in the basin. He undressed slowly, his mind churning through the evening's revelations, and climbed between the sheets. The mattress was somewhat lumpy, but clean, the blankets adequate against the room's chill. Through the slightly open window, he could hear the sea's endless conversation with the shore, and beneath that sound, or perhaps imagined, something that might have been distant voices carried on the wind. The dawn arrived reluctantly, grey light seeping into the sky with the hesitation of something unsure of its welcome. Watson woke to a knock at his door, Mrs. Pascoe with a pitcher of hot water, and the information that breakfast awaited downstairs. He rose, washed, dressed in the practical clothing he had brought for outdoor work, and descended to find Holmes already at table, consuming toast and eggs with methodical efficiency. "Good morning, Watson. I trust you slept adequately, despite our comfortable but somewhat rustic accommodations." "Well enough," Watson replied, helping himself to breakfast from the sideboard. "And you?" "I spent several hours examining the stone Mrs. Trenoweth provided, and then managed perhaps 4 hours of sleep, sufficient for our purposes. The symbols on the stone are fascinating. They bear superficial resemblance to both Ogham script and certain Pictish markings, yet match neither precisely. Whatever language or symbolic system they represent, it is either highly localized or extremely ancient, possibly both. Blackwood arrived as they were finishing breakfast, followed shortly by Captain Treelaw, both men dressed for outdoor work with heavy coats and sturdy boots. The party assembled, collected several lanterns that Mrs. Pascoe provided, and set out through the village toward the promontory, as the sky continued its gradual brightening from charcoal to pearl grey. The village was just stirring to life, smoke beginning to rise from chimneys, a few early workers heading toward their day's labour. They passed the church, its ancient stone tower standing in silent witness as it had for centuries, and then left the last buildings behind, following a footpath that led toward the promontory. The lighthouse grew larger as they approached, its cylindrical form stark against the overcast sky. The tide was indeed low, the causeway revealed as a rough path of rock and packed sand, perhaps 30 yards long, wet and treacherous with accumulated seaweed and pooled water, but passable with care. They proceeded single file, Captain Treelaw leading, each step placed carefully on the uncertain surface. Watson found himself breathing harder than the physical exertion warranted, some combination of the sea air and the building anticipation of what they might discover. The wind was stronger here, unimpeded by any buildings or trees, carrying the salt spray and the cries of gulls that wheeled overhead in their endless patrol. The rocks around the promontory base were dark with water and age, worn smooth in some places and sharp in others where they had broken more recently. They reached the promontory proper, climbing up onto the rock platform that surrounded the lighthouse. The structure towered above them, the keeper's cottage attached to its base, appearing somehow forlorn with its dark windows and closed door. Captain Treelaw produced a key and unlocked the entrance, which had been secured since the Coast Guard's initial investigation. "I thought you would want to examine the lighthouse first," Treelaw explained, pushing the door open. It swung smoothly, revealing a small entry hall, and beyond it, the main room of the keeper's cottage. They entered, and Watson was immediately struck by the orderliness of the space. This was not the chaotic environment of a disturbed mind. Everything was neat, clean, well maintained. The main room served multiple purposes: kitchen, dining room, sitting room. A wooden table bore the remains of a meal exactly as the Coast Guard had found it 3 weeks prior, now somewhat desiccated, but still recognizable as bread and cheese. A shelf of books lined one wall. A cold stove occupied the corner. Through a doorway, Watson could see a bedroom, the bed neatly made. Holmes moved through the space with intense focus, examining everything with his lens, occasionally making notes, touching objects with careful fingers. He spent considerable time at the table where papers were spread. The lighthouse log, the personal diary, various books, including several on Cornish history and archaeology. The log was maintained until the day of disappearance, Holmes murmured, flipping through pages. Weather conditions, ships sighted, lamp maintenance, all recorded in a clear, steady hand. No sign of deteriorating mental state in these official entries. He turned his attention to the diary, reading the entries aloud so Watson could record them. The earlier pages documented mundane aspects of lighthouse keeping, routine maintenance, weather observations, occasional visits from supply boats. But beginning about 2 months prior, the entries took on a different character, becoming more introspective, more troubled. Holmes read selected passages. August 23rd. The dreams began again last night. I had not experienced them in years, but they return with renewed force. I see the promontory as it was long ago, before the lighthouse, when different structures stood here. Men in robes gather beneath the stars, their faces hidden, their voices raised in invocation. He turned pages, continuing. September 1st. I have begun researching the history of this location. The Lighthouse archives contain little, but I have sent to the church library for any available materials. I must understand what I am seeing in these dreams, whether they are merely products of isolation and imagination, or something more. More pages. September 10th. Father Cadogan has allowed me to examine the church records. I have found references that trouble me deeply. This promontory was indeed a site of pre-Christian practice, and the nature of that practice was not benign. The early Christians were right to fear this place, to attempt to consecrate and contain it. But can such ancient forces truly be contained by ritual and prayer? Or do they merely sleep, waiting for the right circumstances to wake? Holmes closed the diary, his expression thoughtful. The progression is clear. A man experiencing vivid dreams, seeking rational explanation through research, discovering historical references that seem to validate his experiences, gradually becoming convinced that something genuine and ancient is occurring. But is this a descent into delusion, or a genuine encounter with something extraordinary? "We won't answer that question here," Captain Treloar said. "The cave is where we need to look, if you're willing." They ascended the spiral stairs inside the lighthouse tower, Holmes examining each level carefully. The storage rooms, the watch room, finally the lantern room at the top, with its great Fresnel lens standing dark and silent. From this height, the view was extraordinary despite the overcast conditions. The grey sea extending to the horizon, the village nestled in its bay, the wild coastline stretching north and south, all rendered in shades of grey and green, and the darker grey-black of wet rock. Holmes spent several minutes examining the lamp mechanism, finding it in perfect working order, the oil reservoir full, just as Blackwood's letter had indicated. He could have lit the lamp that night with no difficulty, Holmes observed. Whatever compelled him away from his duty, it overcame 27 years of perfect reliability. They descended and exited the cottage, locking it behind them, and Captain Treloar led them around the promontory's perimeter, moving carefully among rocks slick with seaweed and spray. The sea was relatively calm, but even so, waves surged against the rocks with impressive force, sending up spray that caught the morning light in brief rainbows before falling back. "Here," Treloar said, stopping before what appeared to be a jumbled fall of rocks against the cliff face. "The entrance is concealed behind these stones. At higher tides, it's completely submerged, but at low tide like now, it's accessible if you don't mind getting wet." He demonstrated, climbing carefully over the outer rocks, finding handholds and footholds with practiced skill. Holmes followed with surprising agility for someone generally associated with indoor investigation, and Watson brought up the rear, glad for his military training that had taught him to manage difficult terrain. Behind the rockfall, a cleft in the cliff face revealed itself, perhaps 3 feet wide, opening into darkness that their eyes could not penetrate from this angle. Water dripped from the rocks above, and the sound of the sea was amplified here, echoing off stone in ways that created strange acoustic effects. Treloar lit one of the lanterns they had brought, the flame catching and steadying, pushing back the darkness slightly. "I'll lead, Mr. Holmes. Stay close and watch your footing. The floor is uneven and slippery." They entered the cave, moving from grey morning light into the warm yellow globe of lantern light, surrounded by pressing darkness. The passage was narrow initially, barely wide enough for a man to walk upright, the walls rough stone showing clear signs of being water-worn over immense periods. The air was cold and damp, carrying the scent of salt and stone, and something else. Something organic and slightly unpleasant that Watson couldn't immediately identify. They descended, the passage angling downward as Treloar had mentioned, moving carefully, Watson's boots occasionally slipping on wet rock. The sound of the sea faded gradually, replaced by the drip of water and their own breathing and the slight scuff of their careful footsteps. After perhaps 20 meters, the passage widened into a small chamber, and here Treloar paused, raising his lantern high. The walls showed the carvings he had mentioned, symbols cut deep into the stone, similar to those on the stone Mary Trenoweth had provided, but more extensive, covering large sections of the wall surface. Holmes immediately produced his lens, examining them closely, his breath visible in the cold air as he murmured to himself. Extraordinary. Watson, do you see the consistency? These symbols match those on the stone, but here there are complete sequences, entire texts, perhaps, or liturgies. The depth of carving suggests great age. These have been here for centuries at minimum, possibly much longer. The floor of the chamber showed the marks in sand that Treloar had mentioned. Not clear footprints now, as tide action had rendered them indistinct, but definitely disturbances suggesting human passage. And toward the back of the chamber, something else. Drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled deeper into the cave system. The passage continues, Treloar said, indicating a narrower opening at the chamber's far end. That's as far as we went previously. Beyond that, I cannot say what lies. Holmes moved to the opening, shining his lantern through it. The light revealed another passage, this one steeper, descending more sharply into the rock. We must see where it leads, he said simply. You needn't come further, Captain, but Watson and I will continue. Treloar hesitated, clearly torn between duty and the memory of his previous experience here. Finally, he nodded. I'll come. Someone should know where you are if... well, someone should know. They proceeded through the narrow opening. Holmes first, then Watson, then Treloar, each man's lantern creating a sphere of light that barely touched the darkness beyond. The passage was tighter here, requiring them to turn sideways in places, and the descent was steep enough that Watson had to brace himself against the walls to avoid sliding. The air grew noticeably colder as they descended, and that organic smell grew stronger, not rotting exactly, but ancient, like opening a tomb sealed for generations. The walls here showed less water damage, being presumably above the highest tide levels, and more of the carved symbols were visible, becoming almost overwhelming in their coverage, as if whoever had made them had been driven by desperate need to record or inscribe. Then the passage opened suddenly into a larger space, a chamber significantly larger than the one above, and this one clearly not entirely natural. The floor had been levelled, the walls worked smooth in places, and around the chamber's perimeter, carved into niches at regular intervals, stood objects. Holmes raised his lantern high, and the light revealed what appeared to be statues, crude figures, perhaps 2 feet tall, carved from dark stone, their forms vaguely humanoid but distorted, elongated, wrong in ways that made the eye uncomfortable. There were 13 of them, Watson counted, spaced evenly around the chamber's circumference. In the chamber's centre, a flat stone had been placed or carved, an altar unmistakably, its surface worn smooth by use and marked with stains that might have been anything but suggested blood. The drag marks visible in the sand of the outer chamber continued here, leading to this central stone. Dear God, Treelor breathed. This was a temple, a place of worship. Holmes moved around the chamber systematically, examining each element with his lens, occasionally stopping to make detailed sketches in his notebook. Watson felt a profound discomfort in this space, as if they were trespassing somewhere that human presence was not welcome, had never been welcome. The very air seemed heavy, resistant, as if they moved through something thicker than ordinary atmosphere. These carvings are extensive, Holmes said, his voice carefully neutral. They appear to describe or depict some form of ritual practice. The figures around the perimeter likely represent deities or entities invoked during such rituals. The central stone is clearly an altar. Note the channels carved into its surface, designed to carry away liquids. He moved to examine the altar more closely, and Watson joined him, his medical training allowing him to examine the stains objectively, despite his discomfort. These could be blood, he confirmed. Though their age is impossible to determine, they could be centuries old or relatively recent. The stone shows signs of repeated use over long periods. Treelor had remained near the entrance, clearly unwilling to penetrate deeper into the chamber. Mr. Holmes, what is this place? What were they doing here? Holmes straightened, his expression troubled in the lantern light. Based on the evidence, this was a ritual chamber used for ceremonies likely involving offerings or sacrifices, probably dating to pre-Roman times. Such practices were not uncommon among the Celtic peoples who inhabited this region. What is unusual is the chamber's preservation and apparent continued use much later than such practices typically persisted. The references in the church records suggest locals knew of this place and feared it even into relatively recent centuries. He paused, looking around the chamber one more time. The question that concerns us is not the historical use of this space, but whether Josiah Tremaine came here, and if so, what happened to him. Watson, you note the drag marks leading to the altar. Help me examine it more closely. Together, they approached the central stone, and here, at close range with the lanterns near, they discovered something that made Watson's breath catch. On the altar's surface, partially obscured by the ancient stains, were fresher marks, scratches in the stone that had exposed lighter rock beneath, suggesting very recent origin. Holmes examined them with his lens, his face intent. These are claw marks, he said quietly. Or perhaps more accurately, marks made by fingernails scraping desperately at stone. Watson, look at the pattern. Someone lying on this stone, struggling, their hands clawing for purchase. Watson felt suddenly cold, colder than the chamber's temperature justified. You think Tremaine. I think Tremaine came here, either of his own compulsion or possibly brought here by others. I think something occurred on or around this altar that resulted in his disappearance. But what exactly? Holmes straightened, looking around the chamber with renewed intensity. Where did he go? There is no body, no evidence of death or violence beyond these marks. The chamber has only one entrance, through which we came. So, where is Josiah Tremaine? Captain Treelor had backed further toward the entrance passage. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I must insist we leave this place. I can feel it, the wrongness I mentioned before. It's stronger down here, as if the very stone resents our presence. We've seen what there is to see. We can report it, seal the cave, ensure no one else comes to harm here. But Holmes was not ready to leave. He moved to the chamber's perimeter, examining each of the 13 stone figures, studying the walls between them, tapping at the stone, listening for any sound that might indicate a hollow space or hidden passage. Behind the 7th figure, Watson counted them off. Holmes paused. "Watson, bring your lantern here." Watson joined him, raising the light. Behind the figure, barely visible, was what appeared to be another opening. Not a natural fissure, but a carved doorway, low and narrow, half concealed by the statue that stood before it. "A passage," Holmes murmured, "or a doorway to another chamber. The drag marks might continue through here. It's impossible to tell with the stone floor." He made to enter the opening, but Watson put a hand on his arm. "Holmes, the captain is right. We don't know where that leads, how stable the rock is, what might be down there. We came to gather evidence, and we have done so. We can organize a more thorough exploration with additional men and equipment." For a moment, Holmes looked as though he might argue, that familiar stubbornness asserting itself. But then he looked at Watson's face, at the genuine concern there, and at Treelaw, who had moved back into the chamber specifically to support Watson's caution, and he nodded slowly. "Very well. You're right, of course. Recklessness serves no purpose. We shall return to the surface, organize our findings, and determine the appropriate next steps." They retraced their path, up through the narrow passage, through the upper chamber, with its overwhelming symbols, through the entrance cleft, and back out into the morning air. Watson had never been so grateful for sunlight, even the thin grey light of an overcast Cornish morning. He drew deep breaths, clearing his lungs of the cave's stale, heavy air, feeling as if he were emerging from drowning. They made their way back across the causeway, which was already beginning to be threatened by the returning tide, and climbed the path back toward the village. None of them spoke during the walk, each processing what they had seen, each trying to fit the physical evidence into some framework of understanding. Back at the inn, Mrs. Pascoe took one look at them and immediately provided hot tea and a warming fire, asking no questions, but clearly recognizing that they had experienced something that required recovery. They sat in silence for several minutes, warming themselves, grateful for the ordinary, comfortable surroundings after the cave's strangeness. Finally, Watson spoke. "What do we do now, Holmes?" The detective set down his teacup with careful precision. "We assess what we know. We have established that Tremaine became increasingly obsessed with the promontory's history. We have found a ritual chamber that confirms the historical references he discovered. We have evidence suggesting he was in that chamber, possibly on the altar itself. But we have no explanation for his disappearance. No body, no clear indication of what occurred." He stood, moving to the window, looking out toward the promontory, visible in the distance. "The chamber has at least one additional passage or space that we did not explore. That is where the answer must lie. Whatever happened to Josiah Tremaine, the evidence of it will be found in that deeper space." "You propose to return?" Treelaw asked, his expression showing clear reluctance. "Not immediately. As Watson wisely suggested, we should organize more thoroughly. Additional lanterns, ropes, perhaps surveying equipment to map the cave system. and I believe we should bring additional men. If something dangerous awaits in that deeper passage, we should be prepared." He turned back to face them. "Mr. Blackwood, could you organize such a party? I would suggest tomorrow morning at the earliest. Today, we can rest, organize our equipment, and I would like to spend time studying the symbols we observed. I sketched many of them, and with proper analysis, they may reveal information about the chamber's purpose, and perhaps about what occurred there." Blackwood nodded. "I can gather 4 or 5 reliable men, equip them properly. Captain Treelaw, I assume you'll join us?" The captain nodded reluctantly. "Aye, it's my duty, though I'll confess I'll be glad when we've solved this mystery and can seal that place permanently. Nothing good dwells in such spaces." The remainder of the day was spent in preparation and quiet recovery. Holmes closeted himself in his room with his sketches and the stone Mary Trenoweth had provided, attempting to decode the symbol system, or at least identify patterns that might suggest meaning. Watson wrote up his notes, organizing the chronology of events, creating a clear timeline from Tremaine's first dreams to his final diary entry. Toward evening, as Watson sat by the fire in the common room, Mary Trenoweth appeared at the inn, asking to speak with them. Holmes was summoned from his room, and she repeated her question from the night before, but now with greater urgency. "Mr. Holmes, have you found Josiah? Is there hope?" Holmes's expression was gentle, which Watson always found remarkable, given his friend's general preference for pure rationality over sentiment. "Mrs. Trenoweth, I cannot give you false comfort. We have found no sign of Mr. Tremaine himself, though we have discovered where he went, and evidence of his presence there. I believe we may find more definitive answers tomorrow when we explore more thoroughly. But I will be honest, the circumstances suggest an outcome that may not bring the comfort you seek." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded with dignity. "I feared as much. Josiah was a good man, Mr. Holmes. Whatever happened, he did not deserve it. I hope you can at least give him peace, and give those of us who cared for him some understanding of what occurred." "That is precisely what I intend to do," Holmes assured her. "You have my word." After she departed, Watson found himself unsettled, pacing before the fire. "Holmes, what do you truly believe happened to Tremaine? All evidence points to him being in that chamber. But then, where did he go? There's only one entrance, and it's impossible he could have been missed by the Coast Guard when they searched." Holmes sighed, rubbing his eyes with thumb and forefinger, a rare gesture of fatigue. "Watson, I have constructed and discarded a dozen theories today. The rational explanations do not fit the evidence. A body hidden in a space we haven't yet discovered remains possible, but the manner of his disappearance suggests something else." He hesitated, which was unlike him, then continued in a quieter voice. "You know my commitment to rationality, to the principle that the universe operates according to natural laws. But I have learned that natural may encompass far more than we typically acknowledge. If ancient peoples performed rituals in that chamber, if they believed they could invoke or interact with entities beyond normal perception, and if Tremaine came to believe the same and acted on that belief, then we must consider possibilities that rational materialism would normally reject." Watson stared at him. "You're suggesting the supernatural is real, that something took him." "I'm suggesting I don't yet know. which is a position I find profoundly uncomfortable," Holmes replied with a slight, humourless smile. "Tomorrow's exploration will hopefully provide clarity. Until then, we should rest. It may be a long and taxing day." Morning arrived with rain, a steady drizzle that turned the world grey and blurred, that made surfaces slick and complicated any outdoor activity. But the tide would be low at the appointed time, regardless of weather. And so, the party assembled as planned. Holmes and Watson, Captain Treelaw and Edmund Blackwood, and 4 village men, chosen for their reliability and physical capability. They gathered at the inn, where Mrs. Pascoe had prepared a substantial breakfast and organised their equipment: multiple lanterns and extra oil, coils of rope, tools for clearing rock or prying at stone, notebooks and pencils for documentation, first aid supplies from Watson's medical bag. They ate methodically, fueling themselves for the exertion ahead, and then set out through the rain toward the promontory. The causeway crossing was more treacherous in the wet, but they managed it without incident, and soon stood again before the cave entrance. One by one, they climbed through the rockfall and entered the passage, the lantern light creating spheres of warm yellow that pushed weakly against the darkness. The descent to the upper chamber, then through the narrow passage to the ritual chamber, took longer with the larger group, but eventually they all stood in that disturbing space with its stone figures and central altar. The village men crossed themselves, muttering prayers, clearly disturbed by the atmosphere of the place. Holmes moved directly to the 7th statue, to the concealed doorway behind it. "This is where we must go," he announced. "The passage beyond is where we will find our answers. I will lead, with Dr. Watson directly behind me. Captain Treelaw, if you would coordinate the others in maintaining our connection to the entrance. A rope linking us would be prudent." They organised themselves as Holmes directed, tying a rope around his waist and paying it out as he entered the concealed doorway, Watson following close behind, then Treelaw, then the others at intervals. The passage beyond was lower than those previously traversed, requiring them to stoop, nearly to crawl in places. The walls pressed close, and Watson felt the weight of the rock above them as a physical presence. Tons of stone held suspended by nothing but its own structural integrity, ready to crush them if it chose. They descended further, the passage twisting, turning back on itself, angling ever downward into the heart of the promontory. The air grew colder still, and now that organic smell was stronger, unmistakable, the scent of something that had once been living but was no longer, preserved by the cold and the stone from full decay. Then Holmes stopped abruptly, his lantern raised, and Watson heard his sharp intake of breath. "Watson, you should see this." Watson moved alongside him, their lanterns combining to illuminate what lay ahead, a final chamber, smaller than the ritual space above, but complete in itself. And here, finally, they found Josiah Tremaine. He sat against the far wall, or what remained of him sat there, the body in an advanced state of mummification rather than rot, preserved by the chamber's conditions. His lighthouse keeper's uniform was recognizable despite 3 weeks of time's passage. His hands were clasped in his lap, his head tilted back against the stone, his face. Watson forced himself to look, his face frozen in an expression that was either ultimate peace or ultimate horror. It was impossible to say which. "My God," Watson breathed, moving forward, his medical instincts overriding his revulsion. He knelt beside the body, making a quick examination. He's been here since his disappearance, I would judge. The mummification suggests very dry air, despite the cave system's general dampness. Perhaps this chamber has some ventilation we can't immediately detect. Cause of death. He examined more closely, finding no obvious injury. I cannot determine without a proper autopsy, but I see no evidence of violence or trauma. He may have died of exposure, or possibly of heart failure, though his expression suggests. He trailed off, unsure how to articulate what the expression suggested. Holmes had moved past them, examining the chamber itself with his lantern held high. The walls here were covered in more symbols, but these appeared different, fresher somehow, as if they had been carved or painted more recently than the ancient marks in the ritual chamber above. "Watson, Treloar, look at this!" They joined him, and in the lantern light they could see that the symbols on these walls formed a continuous narrative, a sequence that started near the entrance and spiraled around the chamber to culminate near where Tremaine's body sat. "It's a story," Holmes murmured, tracing the symbols with his finger without quite touching the stone. "Or a record. The beginning here shows the promontory as it was anciently, with the ritual chamber, with ceremonies performed. Then, the coming of new people, new beliefs. Christianity symbolized here by a cross, the ceiling of the chamber, the construction of something above it, the lighthouse, I assume. Years passing, represented by these repeated marks. And then here, near the end, a figure, solitary, drawn to the chamber. Dreams depicted by these swirling patterns, descent through the passages, arrival in the ritual chamber, and then he moved to the sequence's conclusion, near where Tremaine sat. The symbols here were different, more abstract, suggesting transformation or transition rather than physical movement. And at the very end, a single figure standing at a threshold, stepping through into nothing. Blankness. The wall beyond that final symbol bore no markings at all, as if the story had ended, or the storyteller had lost the ability to continue. He carved these, Watson realized. Tremaine. After he came down here, he spent his time recording his own experience in the symbol system he'd been researching. "Indeed," Holmes confirmed. "Look at the tool marks, fresh, done with some implement he must have brought with him. And the final symbols. Watson, if I'm reading this correctly, he's describing not his death, but his passage. He believed he was transitioning to somewhere else, somewhere beyond physical reality." Captain Treloar had remained near the entrance with the village men, none willing to enter the chamber fully. "Mr. Holmes, we have found poor Tremaine. Surely now we should remove his body and depart this accursed place." Holmes nodded slowly. Yes, you're right. There's nothing more to learn here. Tremaine came to this place, driven by dreams and compulsion. He performed or participated in some ritual he believed would allow him to pass beyond normal reality. Whether that belief was delusion or something more, he clearly died here, believing it was occurring. That is as much answer as we're likely to receive. They organized the removal of the body with as much dignity as the circumstances permitted, wrapping Tremaine in canvas they had brought for that possible purpose, and carefully maneuvering him back through the tight passages. It was grim work, made harder by the confined space, and the need to treat the remains with respect despite the difficulties. By the time they emerged from the cave entrance back into daylight, still grey and rain-streaked, but infinitely preferable to the cave's oppressive darkness. They were all exhausted, wet with spray and sweat, and profoundly grateful to be done. They carried Tremaine's body back across the causeway, which was rapidly disappearing under the advancing tide, timing their crossing with barely minutes to spare. The village men bore him up to the church, where Father Cadogan waited, having been informed of their mission. The priest blessed the body, and it was placed in the church's small mortuary to await formal arrangements. Back at the inn, Mrs. Pascoe had hot baths drawn and provided food and drink with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that the men before her had experienced something that required recovery and comfort. Holmes and Watson bathed, changed into dry clothes, and met in Holmes's room where the detective had laid out his sketches and notes. "Well, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "we have found Josiah Tremaine and can return his body for proper burial. We have discovered the ritual chamber that he spent his final weeks researching. We have evidence of the historical practices that took place there, and confirmation of the accounts we received from witnesses. In every practical sense, we have solved the case." "And yet," Watson prompted, sensing his friend's hesitation, "and yet, we have not truly explained what happened. Did Tremaine die of natural causes? Exposure? Heart failure? Some medical event brought on by stress and exhaustion? That would be the rational conclusion. Or did something else occur? Something related to the rituals he believed were possible. Something that caused his death, or translated him somewhere beyond our ability to follow. The symbols he carved suggest he believed the latter. His expression in death was consistent with either transcendent experience or terminal delusion." Holmes moved to the window, looking out at the rain-obscured view of the promontory. "I have spent my career insisting that the impossible, once you eliminate it, leaves only the improbable truth. But what if the impossible is itself the truth? What if there are realms of experience that rational materialism cannot encompass? I find myself unsettled, Watson. This case has pushed me toward conclusions I am uncomfortable accepting, yet unable to fully dismiss." Watson joined him at the window, placing a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Perhaps the truth is somewhere between pure rationality and pure mysticism. Tremaine believed he could transcend through ritual and will. That belief may have been strong enough to induce a physiological response. Heart failure, perhaps, or some other medical crisis. He died, but he died believing he was succeeding, which gave him peace. Is that not its own form of truth?" Holmes was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Perhaps that is the most complete answer we can provide. He achieved the transcendence he sought, even if it was the transcendence of death, mistaken for something more." They stood together, watching the rain, watching the lighthouse standing its lonely vigil on the promontory, and gradually the tension of the past days began to ease. They had done what they came to do. They had found Josiah Tremaine, and could provide closure to those who cared about him. If mystery remained, if some questions could not be fully answered, perhaps that was acceptable. Perhaps some mysteries were meant to remain partially veiled, suggesting possibilities beyond the concrete and known. The following day, as arrangements were made for Tremaine's burial, and the cave entrance was officially sealed by the Coast Guard, Holmes and Watson visited Father Cadogan at the church. The priest received them in his study, a small room lined with books that smelled of old paper and candle wax, and listened as Holmes provided a carefully edited account of what they had discovered. So he died in that ancient place, believing he was passing beyond, Father Cadogan said softly when Holmes finished. I cannot say whether his belief was delusion or revelation. Such matters are beyond my authority to judge. But I can ensure he receives Christian burial, and that prayers are said for his soul, whatever journey it has taken. That would be appropriate, Holmes agreed. And the cave, Captain Treelaw will seal the entrance, perhaps with concrete or iron bars, ensuring no one else is tempted to explore it. The ritual chamber should remain undisturbed, its purposes relegated to history where they belong. The priest nodded. I will perform a blessing over the sealed entrance as well. Whether such rituals have efficacy against ancient forces, I cannot say, but they provide comfort to the living, and that is valuable in itself. They discussed arrangements for the funeral, which would take place the following day, and then Father Cadogan raised a matter that had clearly been troubling him. Mr. Holmes, the symbols you observed, in your estimation, were they merely decorative, or did they represent actual knowledge, actual power? Holmes considered his answer carefully. Father, I believe they represented a system of belief and practice that ancient peoples found meaningful and perhaps effective according to their understanding. Whether that effectiveness was purely psychological or reflected something more fundamental about reality, I cannot say with certainty. I can say that Tremaine believed they held power, and that belief shaped his final actions. Beyond that, I leave such questions to minds more philosophically inclined than my own. The priest smiled slightly. A diplomatic answer, Mr. Holmes, perhaps the wisest one available. I thank you for your efforts here, and for treating these matters with the seriousness they deserve. You could have dismissed everything as superstition and delusion, but you took the time to understand, to investigate thoroughly. That speaks well of you. They departed the church and walked through the village, which was slowly returning to normalcy now that Tremaine had been found, and the mystery explained as fully as it could be. Fishermen were preparing their boats, shops were opening, children played in the streets, despite the lingering drizzle. Life continued, as it always did, absorbing tragedy and mystery, and moving forward because there was no alternative. Edmund Blackwood met them at the inn that evening for a final meal together. The solicitor appeared relieved but also melancholy, the weight of the past weeks showing in his face. The parish council has asked me to convey their gratitude, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. You've provided answers where we had only questions, and you've done so with respect for our community and for poor Tremaine. We are in your debt. No debt exists, Holmes assured him. We did what we came to do, though I confess the case proved more complex than I initially anticipated. I trust the village will recover from these events. In time, yes, we're resilient here, accustomed to hardship and loss. The sea takes its toll regularly. We understand death, even mysterious death. Knowing that Josiah died pursuing something he believed in, rather than simply vanishing without explanation, provides a kind of closure. His funeral tomorrow will allow us to properly mourn and remember him. They spoke of other matters over dinner: the village's history, the challenges of coastal life, the changes coming even to remote places as the modern age advanced. It was comfortable conversation, gentler than the intensity of the previous days, allowing them all to decompress from the strain of investigation and discovery. That night, Watson slept more peacefully than he had since arriving in Pendennis Point. His dreams were still coloured by the experiences of the past days, but they lacked the oppressive quality that had characterised earlier nights. He woke in the morning feeling genuinely rested, and when he looked out his window toward the promontory, the lighthouse seemed less ominous somehow, just a structure doing its job, standing watch over dangerous waters. The funeral took place at mid-morning, under skies that had finally begun to clear, patches of blue appearing between the grey clouds. The entire village attended, filling the small church to capacity, with many standing outside. Father Cadogan conducted the service with simple dignity, speaking of Tremaine's 27 years of faithful service, of his dedication to duty, of his quiet kindness to those who knew him. Holmes and Watson stood near the back, observers more than participants. But when it came time to carry the coffin to the churchyard for burial, they joined the other bearers, feeling it appropriate to perform this final service for the man whose mystery they had unravelled. After the burial, Mary Trenoweth approached them quietly, pressing a small package into Holmes's hands. "Josiah would have wanted you to have this, I think. It's his journal of research, separate from his diary. Perhaps you'll find use for it, or perhaps you'll simply keep it safe. Either way, I know it's in good hands." Holmes accepted it with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Trenoweth. I will treasure it, both for the knowledge it contains and for what it represents about a man dedicated to understanding, even at cost to himself." She nodded, tears on her cheeks, and moved away to join other mourners. The gathering slowly dispersed, people returning to their daily lives, the rhythm of the village reasserting itself. Holmes and Watson remained a bit longer, standing by the grave as workers began filling it, watching the earth gradually cover the coffin that held what remained of Josiah Tremaine. "He was a brave man," Watson said quietly. "Whatever drove him to that cave, whatever he believed awaited him there, it took courage to face it." "Indeed," Holmes agreed. "Misguided courage, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. He sought answers to questions most people never even think to ask. That he paid the ultimate price for that seeking is tragic, but not without meaning. His research, his documentation, his final account, these things have value, even if we cannot fully understand them." They walked back to the village together, through lanes where primroses bloomed in sheltered spots, despite the season's lateness, past stone walls that had stood for centuries, and would stand for centuries more. At the inn, they found their bags packed. Mrs. Pascoe had taken the initiative, knowing they would be departing now that their purpose was complete. The afternoon train would carry them back toward London, back toward the familiar world of Baker Street, and ordinary cases, of problems, that yielded to logic and observation, without requiring ventures into philosophical deep waters. And yet, Watson suspected, neither of them would forget Pendennis Point, would forget the lighthouse standing its lonely watch, would forget the ritual chamber beneath the promontory where ancient practices had been performed, and where a modern man had sought connection with mysteries older than civilization. They said their farewells to Blackwood and Captain Treelaw, to Father Cadogan and Mary Trenoweth, to Mrs. Pascoe, who had cared for them with such kindness. They accepted the gratitude of the village and the promises to write if any further information came to light. And then they climbed aboard the trap that would carry them to the station, watching Pendennis Point recede behind them as the horse walked steadily along the rain-washed lanes. At the station, while they waited for the train, Holmes withdrew the carved stone from his pocket. Mary Trenoweth had ultimately insisted he keep it. He turned it over in his fingers, studying the symbols one more time in the clear afternoon light. "These represent knowledge," he said quietly. "But knowledge of what, precisely? Of rituals that could breach the boundaries between worlds, of psychological techniques that could induce transcendent states, of delusions that could consume rational men. I may spend years studying this and Tremaine's research, and still never reach certainty about what truly occurred in that chamber." Watson smiled slightly. "And yet you'll study it nonetheless, because that's who you are. You cannot leave mysteries unexamined, even when examination provides no definitive answers. Perhaps especially when examination provides no definitive answers," Holmes countered. "Those are the mysteries that push understanding forward, that force us to expand our conception of what is possible." The train arrived with a huffing of steam and squeal of brakes. They boarded, finding their compartment, settling in for the long journey back to London. As the train pulled away from Pendennis Point station, Watson caught one last glimpse of the sea, grey and vast, stretching to horizons where sky and water merged into indefinite boundaries. The rhythm of the rails soon established itself, that familiar rocking motion that invited rest and reflection. Holmes immersed himself in Tremaine's research journal, making notes, cross-referencing with his own observations. Watson watched the countryside roll past, his mind gradually settling back into familiar patterns after the strangeness of the past days. By the time they changed trains at Bristol, the experience was already beginning to take on a dreamlike quality, as if it had happened in some parallel world, rather than in the solid, physical reality they now inhabited. The dining car, where they took dinner, was warm and ordinary, the food conventional, the other passengers engaged in mundane conversations about business and family. It was almost possible to believe that ritual chambers and carved symbols, that disappearing lighthouse keepers and ancient callings, belonged to fiction rather than to their actual recent experience. But Holmes's preoccupation with the journal was real enough, as was the carved stone that Watson knew rested in his friend's pocket. Whatever they had encountered in Pendennis Point, it had left traces, had impressed itself upon them in ways that would not quickly fade. Night fell as they travelled through Wiltshire, the landscape outside their window becoming darkness punctuated by occasional lights from isolated farmhouses or small villages. Inside the compartment, the lamp burned steadily, creating an island of warmth and light within which Holmes read and Watson dozed, the two men comfortable in each other's presence, requiring neither conversation nor entertainment, simply existing together as they had for years through countless cases and adventures. The train rolled on through the darkness, carrying them back toward London, back toward the familiar and the known. And yet, Watson felt that something had shifted, some boundary had been crossed, or at least approached. The universe had revealed itself to be larger, stranger, more mysterious than comfortable rationalism preferred to acknowledge. Whether that was troubling or exhilarating, he could not quite decide. Perhaps it was both. They arrived at Paddington Station near midnight, emerging from the train into the familiar chaos of a London terminus. The crowds and noise and smell of coal smoke and humanity somehow reassuring after Cornwall's isolated intensity. A hansom cab carried them through late-night streets to Baker Street, where the windows of 221B showed light. Mrs. Hudson had anticipated their return and left lamps burning in welcome. They climbed the familiar stairs, entered the familiar rooms, and both felt the sense of homecoming that comes from returning to one's proper place after time away. The fire was laid ready to light, the furniture arranged exactly as they had left it, everything speaking of continuity and comfort. Mrs. Hudson appeared briefly with tea and inquiries about their journey, satisfied herself that they were unharmed and not in immediate need of anything beyond rest, and retired with instructions to call if required during the night. Holmes sank into his chair, still holding Tremaine's journal, while Watson performed the small rituals of homecoming, unpacking his bag, sorting correspondence that had accumulated, checking that his room was in order. When he returned to the sitting room, Holmes had finally set aside the journal and sat staring into the fire that Watson had lit, his expression distant and thoughtful. Watson settled into his own chair, accepting the tea that Holmes had poured, content to sit in silence unless his friend wished to speak. Finally, Holmes stirred. "Watson, I am uncertain whether this case represents success or failure. We found Tremaine's body, which provides closure to those who cared about him. We explained the circumstances of his disappearance as fully as evidence permits. But we have not truly solved the mystery. We have merely documented it. Whether Tremaine died from natural causes while in a deluded state, or whether he actually achieved some form of transcendence beyond material existence, remains ultimately unanswerable." Watson sipped his tea, considering his response. Perhaps some mysteries are not meant to be completely solved. Perhaps the value lies in the investigation itself, in the attempt to understand, rather than in achieving absolute certainty. You have honored Tremaine's memory by taking his experiences seriously, by following his journey to its conclusion, by treating his beliefs with respect, even while maintaining your analytical skepticism. That seems success enough to me. Perhaps, Holmes conceded, though it sits uncomfortably with my preference for definitive conclusions. I suspect this case will haunt me, Watson. I will return to it repeatedly in my mind, examining it from new angles, seeking that elusive explanation that satisfies both the evidence and rational principles. Tremaine's research may provide additional insights. He was thorough in his documentation, and his knowledge of local history and practice was considerable. He fell silent again, then spoke more quietly. I found myself, down in that chamber, on the verge of believing in something I cannot rationally accept. The atmosphere of the place, the accumulation of strange details, the sincerity of Tremaine's final accounting, all of it pushed me toward conclusions that violate everything I have built my career upon. That is unsettling. I pride myself on maintaining objectivity, on never allowing emotion or atmosphere to cloud judgment. But in that moment, standing before Tremaine's body, reading the symbols he had carved, I felt the pull of belief in something beyond material causation. Watson understood. He had felt it too, that sense of boundaries thinning, of rational certainty becoming less certain. And what did you conclude in that moment? That I don't know, Holmes admitted, and perhaps cannot know. Which is a position I accept with difficulty, but must accept nonetheless. Not all questions have answerable answers, Watson. I am learning that lesson late in life, but learning it nonetheless. The fire crackled softly, and outside the window, London continued its endless activity. Carriages rattling past, footsteps on pavement, the distant call of a constable marking his rounds. The city went on, indifferent to mysteries and philosophical quandaries, concerned with immediate, practical realities. There was comfort in that indifference, in the return to ordinary life with its ordinary concerns. Watson finished his tea and rose, stretching. "I'm for bed, Holmes. I suggest you do the same. You've had little enough sleep these past days, and exhaustion serves no purpose. Tremaine's research will still be there tomorrow, and you'll approach it with clearer mind after proper rest." Holmes nodded, but didn't rise, remaining in his chair, staring into the fire. Watson left him there, knowing his friend would come to bed when he was ready, when his mind had processed what needed processing and permitted itself to rest. It was Holmes's way, and Watson had long since learned not to press. In his own room, Watson prepared for bed with the pleasant weariness of someone who has completed demanding work and can now legitimately rest. He climbed between sheets that were blessedly familiar, lay his head on his own pillow in his own room, and felt the tensions of the past days begin to release. Tomorrow, they would return to normal routine, to the steady stream of clients who found their way to Baker Street seeking Holmes's unique abilities. The case of the lighthouse keeper's diary would become another entry in Watson's journal, another story to perhaps publish someday when sufficient time had passed. But tonight, as he drifted towards sleep, his thoughts remained in Cornwall, on that windswept promontory where a lighthouse stood watch, where beneath the earth ancient chambers held ancient secrets, where a man had sought transcendence and found at minimum peace. The mystery would remain, never fully solved, but documented, understood as well as it could be, treated with the respect it deserved. Watson's last conscious thought was of waves against stone, of light piercing darkness, of the thin boundaries between the known and the unknown. And then sleep claimed him, gentle and complete, carrying him down into dreams where lighthouses burned in darkness and symbols carved in stone spoke truths that waking minds could not quite grasp, but sleeping minds remembered perfectly. The carved stone rested on his desk, and he touched it briefly, feeling the worn symbols beneath his fingers. Tomorrow he would begin serious study, would attempt to decode what Josiah Tremaine had discovered about the promontory's history and purpose. But tonight he would simply acknowledge the mystery, accept its resistance to complete understanding, and carry it forward as one carries any significant experience, as something that shapes without defining, that influences without controlling. He retired to his room, and soon 221B Baker Street fell silent. Two men sleeping in their separate spaces, both dreaming in their different ways of coasts and caves, of light and darkness, of the spaces between certainty and doubt, where truth might reside in forms too complex for simple declaration. The case was closed, and yet it remained open. Josiah Tremaine had found his final rest, and yet his questions continued echoing. The ritual chamber was sealed, and yet its existence persisted in changing how those who had entered it understood the world. Some mysteries, once encountered, never fully release their hold on those who engage them seriously. They become part of one's internal landscape, questions that resurface at quiet moments, that influence how one interprets subsequent experiences, that remind one that the universe contains more than simple materialism can encompass. And so, the night deepened over London, over Cornwall, over all the places where humans sought meaning and understanding. Lighthouses burned against the darkness. Waves struck stone with patient insistence. Ancient symbols waited in sealed chambers, holding knowledge or delusion, or perhaps both simultaneously. And in a comfortable flat on Baker Street, two men slept, having ventured to the edges of the explicable, and returned with more questions than answers, but with the satisfaction of having honoured both the mystery and the man who had been claimed by it. Dear friends, we have reached the end of our journey tonight. From the familiar comfort of 221B Baker Street to the windswept Cornish coast, from the mystery of a lighthouse keeper's disappearance to the discovery of truths that resist simple understanding. We have travelled together through this tale of wonder and investigation, of rational inquiry meeting the edges of the inexplicable. I hope this story has carried you gently toward rest, that the rhythm of its telling has allowed your own thoughts to quiet, that the mystery has engaged your imagination, while the atmosphere has soothed your spirit. We have walked with Holmes and Watson through this investigation, shared their experiences, both mundane and extraordinary, and perhaps, along the way, found our own thoughts drifting toward that peaceful space between waking and sleep where stories live most vividly. If you have enjoyed this journey into Gothic mystery and Victorian investigation, I would be grateful if you would subscribe to this channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and return for future stories. There are so many tales yet to tell, so many mysteries waiting to unfold in that space we create together with words and imagination. For now, though, let me wish you the gentlest of good nights. May your sleep be deep and peaceful. May your dreams be vivid but kind. And may you wake refreshed, carrying with you perhaps some echo of this story's atmosphere. The sound of waves, the light of lanterns, the comfort of companionship during mysterious times. Sleep well, dear traveller. The mysteries can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, simply rest. Good night.